Think about the oldest sound you've ever heard. Not something recorded, something carried. A lullaby passed from a grandmother to a child. A story told around a fire so many times that no one remembers who told it first. A name for a place that doesn't appear on any modern map, spoken in a language that has no living speakers, and yet somehow the name survived. Now imagine that the earth itself carries sounds like that, not in language, but in stone, in the shape of riverbeds, in the chemical signatures buried in layers of sediment laid down over hundreds of thousands of years. Echoes of things that happened so long ago that the very continents have shifted since then, and still the echoes persist, faint, strange, and remarkably consistent. Tonight, we're going to listen to those echoes together, 6 of them, reaching across deep time from civilizations that may have risen, flourished, and vanished long before anyone thought to write anything down. Some are preserved in myth, the same account of rising waters and a handful of survivors told independently on every inhabited continent, as though the memory of a drowned world was too important for any single culture to let go. Some are encoded in stone foundations that resist easy explanation. Some show up as chemical anomalies in ice cores and sediment layers. The kind of evidence that doesn't argue or persuade, it simply sits there, quietly, waiting to be noticed. That's what this channel is for. The sleepy historian, exploring the deep past, slowly and without hurry, while the rest of the world sleeps. This is a place designed for falling asleep. The story will carry you as far as you want to go, and wherever you stop listening is exactly where you were meant to stop tonight. If this is your first time here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. Settle in, take a breath, a slow one, and let the day fall away from you. The echoes we're about to follow have been waiting for thousands of years, and they'll wait a little longer while you get comfortable. We begin with the oldest echo of all, the farthest one, reaching us across a distance so vast it barely registers as history at all. Nearly every ancient culture on every inhabited continent tells a story about a time before this one, a golden age, a first world, an era when human beings, or something very like human beings, live differently than we do now, longer, more peacefully, in closer harmony with the rhythms of the earth. The ancient Greeks remembered it as the age of Kronos, when the world was mild and the living was effortless, and no one grew old in the way we understand aging. The fruit ripened without cultivation. The rivers ran clear. There was no need for labor, because the earth gave freely, and the beings who lived upon it received freely. And the whole arrangement held together with a grace that later ages could only remember, never reproduce. The Hindu traditions described the Satya Yuga, the age of truth, when wisdom flowed freely and human lifespan stretched across thousands of years, and the distance between what a person knew and what a person did was so narrow that it scarcely existed at all. Indigenous traditions in the Americas speak of previous worlds that existed before this one, each destroyed and rebuilt, each carrying forward some fragment of what came before. Aboriginal Australians hold stories of the Dreamtime, not a distant past, but an underlying reality, a deeper layer of existence that runs beneath the surface of the world we see. The Persian Avesta describes Avara, a great enclosure built before a devastating winter, where the seeds of all living things were preserved against a world that was about to change beyond recognition. These cultures had no meaningful contact with one another. They developed on separate continents, across separate millennia, and yet their oldest memories converge on the same idea. there was something before us, something luminous, something lost. The beings who inhabited this first age, the Ethereal Ones, as some traditions describe them, are remembered as tall, radiant, and somehow less bound by the physical world than we are. Not gods, exactly, not spirits, something in between, as though the boundary between thought and matter was thinner then, and the beings who walk the earth move through it with a lightness we can barely imagine. What ended their world, according to the stories, was fire from the sky. Not the fire of human war, but something older and larger, a cosmic event that changed the atmosphere, altered the light, and forced whatever survived underground or into the margins of a world that had suddenly become hostile and strange. We know now that sun-like stars are capable of producing eruptions thousands of times more powerful than anything we've observed from our own. A sufficiently intense solar event could alter the atmosphere, thin the shield that protects the surface, and change the conditions of life on a planet in ways that take millennia to heal. The great dyings that punctuate Earth's history, the mass extinctions that have periodically swept the planet clean and started the clock again, remind us that cosmic catastrophe is not theory. It is pattern. It has happened before, and the Earth has always, eventually, found its way back. Whether the ethereal ones are memory, metaphor, or something stranger, the stories that preserve them share a common ending. The light changed. The world they knew became uninhabitable, and a handful of survivors carried forward what they could, not in writing, because writing hadn't been invented, but in the only vessel durable enough to cross millennia. Story. A story told so many times that it wore a groove in human memory too deep to erase, even after the tellers had forgotten what it originally meant. And so the first echo fades, not into silence, but into the background, a low hum beneath everything that follows, like a note struck so long ago that only the resonance remains. It will be there, beneath the other echoes, for the rest of the night. You don't need to listen for it. It will find you. Millions of years fold into quiet. Continents drift, ice advances, and retreats across the poles. Each cycle a slow breath drawn across millennia. And somewhere in that patience, sand gathers along the banks of a river that will outlast every civilization that settles beside it. The golden age has faded. But in the desert, something is taking shape. Let your breath slow as the centuries pass. The sand is warm. The air is still. Of all the echoes that reach us across deep time, this one arrives with the most familiar face. You have seen these shapes before, in photographs, in textbooks, in the background of 1,000 stories. The pyramids at Giza, standing at the edge of the desert, the way they have stood for more than 4,000 years. Their geometry so clean and deliberate that they look less like ruins than like something permanent. Something that was always there and always will be. We think we know Egypt. It is the ancient civilization we can organize into dynasties and kingdoms. The one with the tombs and the hieroglyphs and the mummified remains of rulers whose faces we can reconstruct. It is the civilization whose monuments survived, not in fragments, but in full, staggering scale, rising from the sand with a patience that makes the centuries feel like weather. And yet, beneath the familiar surface, Egypt holds questions that have never been fully answered. The Great Sphinx sits in its enclosure at Giza, carved from the living bedrock, facing east toward the rising sun. Its proportions are curious. The head is notably small relative to the body, as though it was recarved from something larger and older. But the most persistent mystery is written not in its shape, but on its skin. The erosion patterns on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure are vertical, deep rounded channels carved by water flowing downward, not the horizontal scoring of wind-driven sand which leaves sharp edges. These are the marks of rainfall, heavy, sustained, prolonged. The geologist, Robert Schoch, examined these patterns and arrived at a conclusion that unsettled the conventional timeline considerably. The last period of sustained heavy rainfall in the Giza region ended thousands of years before the fourth dynasty pharaohs traditionally credited with the Sphinx's construction. If the erosion on the enclosure walls was caused by rain, then the Sphinx may be far older than the civilization we associate it with. It may predate the dynasties entirely. The Egyptians themselves seem to believe something similar. Their oldest mythological tradition speaks of Zep-Tepi, the first time, an era when the gods walked among humans and established the foundations of civilization. Zep-Tepi was not presented as allegory or metaphor. It was presented as history, a time before the pharaohs, before the dynasties, when the world was ordered by beings whose knowledge and power exceeded anything that came after. The temples were older than the priests who tended them. The alignments encoded in stone were older than the astronomers who measured the stars. The monuments, in this telling, were not the achievements of the civilization we know. They were inheritances from something older. When Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, the priests at the temples showed him records, king lists, and chronicles, stretching backward through time far beyond anything the Greek world possessed. They claimed a civilizational memory reaching back more than 10,000 years. Herodotus, who is neither credulous nor dismissive, simply wrote down what they told him. He let the claim stand on its own, the way the pyramids stand on their own, neither arguing nor retreating, simply present. The precision of the Great Pyramid is a subject we will return to later, when we encounter the builders who worked in stone across the ancient world. But here, in the Egyptian context, it is worth pausing on a quieter observation. The earliest known pyramid, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, designed by the architect Imhotep, already demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of engineering and large-scale construction. And the Great Pyramid at Giza, built within a few generations, represents a leap in complexity and precision so dramatic that it still lacks a fully satisfying explanation. As though the knowledge arrived from somewhere else, as though someone was remembering, rather than discovering for the first time. This is the echo that Egypt leaves, the loudest echo in the archaeological record, carried in stone, monuments, visible from space. And yet even this echo, the most studied in all of archaeology, points backward, towards something older, toward a time before the first dynasty, before the first hieroglyph, before the name Egypt itself had meaning, towards Zep-Tepi, the first time, a memory so deep that the civilization we know, the one that preserved its dead for eternity, could not preserve the origin of its own knowledge. Only the sense, persistent and unshakable, that someone had been here before. Let the weight of that settle for a moment, stone catching the last light of a day that ended 4,000 years ago, and still catching it now. There is no hurry. The monuments are patient. They have outlasted everything except the questions. The Nile grows distant, the desert sand settles behind you, and the stone monuments stand in their own silence now. From the east, another river arrives, wider, slower, its waters brown with the silt of mountains beyond the horizon. Along its banks, A different kind of order is taking shape, quieter, more methodical, built from brick rather than stone. Let your shoulders soften. The river will carry you. In the 1920s, railway workers laying track across the plains of what is now Pakistan began uncovering bricks. Not random rubble, uniform, carefully sized bricks, the same dimensions repeating across miles of excavation. What they had stumbled upon was one of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world, and no one had known it existed. Mohenjo-daro emerged from the earth with its grid streets intact. Right angles, uniform block widths, and urban plans so orderly that it looks from above less like an ancient excavation than like the blueprint of a modern city. Alongside Mohenjo-daro, the city of Harappa surfaced, and then, as the digging continued, hundreds more sites scattered across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. A civilization that had stretched along the Indus River and beyond, trading with distant lands, maintaining standards of measurement and construction that remained consistent across vast distances and multiple centuries. The sophistication is startling in its quietness. This was not a civilization that built for spectacle. There are no great pyramids here, no towering temples, no monumental statues of kings. Instead, there are drainage systems, sophisticated networks of covered channels running beneath the streets, carrying wastewater away from every household. Indoor plumbing, engineered with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for thousands of years. Standardized weights and measures, calibrated finely enough to weigh individual gemstones. And at the center of Mohenjo-daro, the Great Bath, a large, carefully waterproofed pool surrounded by walkways and small chambers. Its purpose is unknown. It may have been ceremonial, it may have been practical. What is certain is that it was built with extraordinary care, sealed with natural bitumen to prevent leakage, supplied and drained by channels that still function in principle after 4,500 years. Everything about the Indus Valley civilization suggests a society that valued order, collective infrastructure, and quiet competence over individual grandeur. And then there is the script. Thousands of small stetite seals have been recovered from Indus Valley sites, each one inscribed with symbols arranged in careful sequences alongside images of animals. A unicorn-like bull, an elephant, a rhinoceros. The symbols are consistent. They repeat in patterns that strongly suggest a written language. And after more than a century of study, no one can read a single word. This is not a matter of insufficient evidence. We have thousands of inscriptions. The problem is deeper. There is no bilingual key, no equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, and the texts are short, averaging fewer than 5 symbols per seal. An entire civilization that could write and whose words have survived in fired clay for millennia, and we cannot hear what they are saying. Their voice is preserved. Their meaning is lost. It is one of the most profound silences in the archaeological record. What ended the Indus Valley civilization was not a single catastrophe. There was no fire from the sky, no sudden flood, no army at the gates. Instead, the world simply changed beneath them. The Gargahakra river system, once a wide, life-giving waterway that sustained millions, shifted course and dried. Monsoon patterns changed. The soil that had fed a civilization slowly lost its fertility. And the people, over generations, simply left. They moved eastward and southward, scattering into smaller settlements, carrying with them whatever traditions and knowledge they could hold in memory. The great granaries stood empty. The workshops where artisans had carved their intricate seals fell silent. One by one, the doors closed for the last time. The cities emptied, the streets grew quiet, the drainage channels filled with silt, and within a few centuries, the most extensive civilization of its era had vanished so completely that when Alexander the Great marched through the region 2,000 years later, no one remembered it had ever existed. This is the quietest echo, a civilization that rivaled anything in the ancient world, that built with a precision and collective discipline that still impresses, and that disappeared so thoroughly that its very existence was forgotten for 4,000 years. Found by accident, recovered in fragments, its voice preserved in clay, speaking words that no one alive can understand. Let the silence of those unread words settle around you. There is something almost restful in a mystery that asks nothing of you. No answer, no verdict, no judgment. Only the quiet awareness that something large and careful and patient once stood here, and the earth, which is patient too, folded it gently away. The cities empty slowly. Streets that held thousands grow quiet, one household at a time. Dust settles over drainage channels. Weeds push through brickwork laid by people who expected it to last forever. The seals lie face down in the silt, their messages waiting for readers who will not come for 4,000 years. And from the silence of those empty streets, something else emerges, older, larger, carved into the living rock. There are places on this planet where the stone itself seems to be making an argument. Not in words, stone doesn't argue, but in precision, in the razor-tight joints between blocks weighing dozens of tons, in alignments to true north that modern surveying equipment can barely improve, in the mathematical relationships encoded in dimensions that look, to anyone who takes the measurements seriously, as though someone understood things about the earth and the sky that we didn't think anyone knew that long ago. The Great Pyramid at Giza is perhaps the most familiar example, and it only becomes truly strange when you step past the silhouette and look at the numbers. Its base spans roughly 13 acres and is level to within a few centimeters across that entire expanse. Its four faces are oriented to the cardinal directions with extraordinary accuracy. Shafts within the structure point towards specific stars, as they would have appeared in the ancient sky. Whatever the pyramid was built to do, it was built by people who understood geometry, astronomy, and the relationship between earth and sky with a depth that still inspires quiet awe. But it is not only the numbers, it is the intention. Every surface, every angle, every shaft driven through solid limestone was placed with a care that suggests the builders understood something about permanence, about the difference between building for a generation and building for eternity. Whatever knowledge they possessed, they encoded it in a language older and more durable than any script. The language of geometry, carved into a form that the desert sand and the passing centuries could not erase. 3,000 miles to the northeast, on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, something even older waits beneath a deliberate layer of fill. Göbekli Tepe is approximately 12,000 years old, built at a time when humans were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, with no permanent settlements, no metalworking, no organizational capacity for monumental construction. And yet there it is. Circles of massive stone pillars, some standing over 15 feet tall and weighing up to 10 tons, carved with elaborate animal reliefs that imply generations of accumulated artistic tradition. At some point, the builders buried their own creation, packed tons of rubble over the pillars, entombing them under an artificial hill. No one knows why. It is as though the builders intended to preserve their creation by hiding it, sealing it beneath the earth the way a letter might be sealed in an envelope addressed to a future they could not see. And it worked. The deliberate burial is what saved Göbekli Tepe. While other structures of its era crumbled and vanished, this one waited in the dark for 12,000 years, perfectly preserved beneath the hill that its builders had placed on top of it. And at extreme altitude, in the Andes, the stone blocks of Puma Punku sit in the thin air with a precision that borders on the mechanical. Interlocking andesite blocks, cut with repeating patterns and drilled holes, assembled at an elevation where the air is too thin for sustained heavy labor, using a stone so hard that modern tools struggle to replicate the cuts. The precision is not decorative, it is structural, each block designed to interlock with its neighbors without mortar, the way puzzle pieces fit, except that these pieces weigh tons and were shaped from one of the hardest stones on Earth. 3 sites on 3 continents, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. Each one, taken alone, can be explained as the peak achievement of a single culture's ingenuity. Together, they raise a question that no individual explanation quite puts to rest. There is one more thread in the builder's story worth following before we move on. The Earth's magnetic field, the invisible shield that deflects solar radiation and keeps the atmosphere intact, is not permanent. It weakens, drifts, and periodically reverses polarity entirely. The North Magnetic Pole has been drifting across the Arctic, its pace quickening over the decades as though something beneath the surface is slowly rearranging itself. During a reversal, the protective field weakens and radiation levels at the surface climb. The effects would not arrive as a single catastrophe, but as a slow, grinding unraveling. Crops failing unpredictably, navigation systems losing their reference, auroras dancing at the equator, where they have no business being, the sunrise not quite where it should be, at a solstice. Let that image settle. Auroras at the equator, the familiar sky rearranging itself slowly over generations. Feel the weight of your body wherever you're resting. Feel the stillness of the room around you. The builders left their questions in stone, and the stone is patient. It has nowhere to be. A curious footnote. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world map from older sources, some of which he claimed were ancient. The map depicts coastlines that were not officially explored until centuries later. Whether this is coincidence, misinterpretation, or evidence of cartographic knowledge inherited from a much older tradition remains an open question. One more stone on a pile that keeps growing, quietly, without explanation. And quietly, another echo surfaces, older, stranger, harder to read. The stone gives way to stories of beings who are not like us at all, beings whose names survive in the oldest scriptures of a dozen unconnected civilizations, always described with the same uneasy mix of reverence and warning. Breathe slowly, let the starlight dim. This next echo is the briefest of the 6 and the strangest. Before the flood, before whatever cataclysm the world's oldest stories agree upon, many traditions describe a race of beings who are larger, stronger, and stranger than ordinary humans. The Hebrew scriptures call them the Nephilim. Greek mythology remembers the Titans, who ruled before the Olympian gods overthrew them. Norse tradition speaks of the Jotun, the frost giants who preceded and opposed the gods of Asgard. In Aztec cosmology, The Quinametsin, enormous beings, inhabited an earlier age of the world. The Paiute people of the American Great Basin preserve accounts of red-haired giants who lived in caves near the shores of ancient lakes. In Hindu tradition, the Asuras and Danavas were powerful beings whose conflicts with the gods shaped the landscape of the cosmos. Different continents, different millennia, different theological frameworks, and yet the same figure keeps appearing. Large, powerful, associated with a world that existed before this one, and ultimately destroyed, sometimes by divine intervention, sometimes by their own hubris, sometimes by forces that the stories describe in language that sounds, to modern ears, uncomfortably specific. The Book of Enoch, an ancient text excluded from most biblical canons, but preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, describes beings called the Watchers, who descended to earth and taught forbidden knowledge to humanity. The knowledge they shared is enumerated with surprising precision: metalworking, cosmetics, astronomy, the arts of war. The implication is not that knowledge itself was evil, but that it arrived too quickly, without the wisdom needed to contain it. In the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, one of the oldest cities of the Indus Valley civilization, archaeologists have noted traces of something unusual: sections of stone that appear to have been vitrified, turned to glass by extreme heat. In the Libyan desert, sheets of natural glass lie scattered across the sand, formed by temperatures that no ordinary geological process easily explains. The Mahabharata, one of the great Sanskrit epics, describes weapons of vast and terrible power in language so vivid that it has echoed through the centuries. Though the texts were composed thousands of years before anyone could have known what such descriptions might come to mean. These are quiet anomalies. They do not prove anything. They sit at the edges of what we know, like stones that don't quite fit the wall, and they invite a kind of wondering that has no definitive answer. Only the quiet, persistent sense that something happened here, something large and strange, and the earth has long since grown over the evidence. There is no verdict to reach. The anomalies are not asking to be solved tonight. They are simply there, quiet, patient, older than any living controversy, and far less interested in being right than in being noticed. Whatever happened in those older ages, the land has long since healed. Forests grew over the scars, rivers found new paths, dust became soil, and wildflowers pushed through the cracks in ancient stone. Life, remarkably persistent, remarkably patient, carried on. Let your jaw unclench. The strangeness rests in the deep past now, fading like a sound heard through many walls. The next echo is closer, almost within reach. Around 13,000 years ago, the world was warming. The ice that had covered much of the northern hemisphere for 100,000 years was finally retreating. Glaciers pulled back, forests crept north, rivers swelled with meltwater, and along the coasts and in the fertile valleys of the Near East, something remarkable was happening. A people we call the Natufians were building stone houses, not temporary shelters, permanent structures with foundations and storage rooms. They were grinding grain, tending wild plants that would eventually become the first domesticated crops, and organizing themselves into communities that looked less like nomadic bands and more like the earliest sketches of what we now call civilization. They were not supposed to be doing any of this. According to the conventional timeline, settled agriculture and permanent architecture wouldn't emerge for another several thousand years. And yet, the Natufians were already there, quietly contradicting the schedule. In the Fertile Crescent of the Near East, the earliest experiments in what we now call civilization were quietly underway, not as a sudden invention, but as a gradual reassembly, as though the ideas had been waiting in the soil alongside the seeds, and the warming world had finally given them permission to surface. Were they the first, or were they rebuilding something from memory, the descendants of an earlier tradition, reassembling what they could from fragments carried forward through centuries of disruption? Göbekli Tepe, built during this same window, suggests that organized labor and monumental ambition predated agriculture itself. The conventional sequence, farming, then surplus, then settlements, then monuments, may have the order wrong. And then the warmth ended. Around 12,800 years ago, something arrived from beyond the atmosphere, silently, without warning. The evidence is spread across multiple continents in a thin layer of sediment that tells a consistent and remarkable story. Nanodiamonds, crystals that form only under conditions of extreme heat and pressure. Glass spherules, scattered like beads from a broken string. An anomalous spike in platinum concentrations that has no obvious terrestrial source. And beneath all of it, charcoal. Layers of charcoal consistent with wildfires burning across millions of acres simultaneously. This is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The theory holds that a fragmented comet struck the northern ice sheets, turning vast quantities of ice to vapor and filling the upper atmosphere with dust. The consequences unfolded from three directions at once: heat from above, a deep cold returning from the north as temperatures dropped back to glacial levels within a matter of years, and water rising along the coasts as destabilized ice sheets released their mass into the ocean. The world that had been warming went cold again, almost overnight in geological terms. The Younger Dryas, a period of roughly 1,200 years of renewed glacial conditions, descended like a curtain. Dozens of large mammal species vanished. The woolly mammoth, the mastodon, the giant ground sloth, the saber-toothed cat. An entire ecosystem faded away, and with it, any communities that had woven their lives into its rhythms. If coastal civilizations existed during this window, settlements built along shores that now lie deep beneath the sea, they would have been caught in the worst of it, and their remains would now be buried under thousands of years of accumulated silt in waters that we have barely begun to survey. The ice core record shows the temperature drop as a vertical cliff in the data, a line so sharp it looks like someone drew it with a ruler. On one side, a warming world full of promise. On the other, 1,000 years of winter. Let that image settle. The cliff in the data, the warmth vanishing, the long cold descending, the Natufian stone houses, the builder's precision, the Ethereal Ones' golden age, all of them, perhaps, echoes of the same recurring pattern. Something rises, something falls, and the survivors begin again with whatever they manage to carry through. Thousands of years compress into a single breath. The ice retreats, the waters find their level. Seeds waiting in frozen soil begin tentatively to germinate, and slowly, like someone waking from a long sleep, the human story resumes. In Sumer, in Egypt, along the Indus, appearing almost out of nowhere with writing and mathematics and astronomy already in hand, as though several chapters had been skipped. Take a slow breath. Let your hands go still. We've passed through the echoes now. What follows is the pattern they make when you step back far enough to see them all at once. When you lay 6 civilizations end to end, whether you believe they existed literally or view them as the distorted echoes of real events filtered through millennia of retelling, something curious happens. The stories start to rhyme. Each one rises in a period of warmth and stability. Each one reaches a peak of complexity and ambition. Each one falls, not to a single cause, but to a convergence of pressures. Cosmic events from above, environmental shifts from below, and the internal contradictions of a society that has grown powerful enough to be fragile. And in every case, a handful of survivors carry something forward. Not everything, a fragment, a candle carried through a storm, barely shielded from the wind, its flame reduced to the faintest possible glow, but still burning. The survivor archetype is one of the most consistent figures in all of human mythology. In the oldest Sumerian account, Utnapishtim builds a vessel and fills it with the seeds of all living things, riding out a flood that scours the world clean. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah receives the same warning and builds the same vessel. In India, Manu is guided to high ground by a great fish. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive Zeus's flood and repopulate the earth by casting stones over their shoulders, the earth itself becoming the raw material for a new beginning. The names change across continents and millennia. The shape of the story does not. Water rises, a warning comes, a few survive, and they carry something precious into whatever diminished age follows. What survives is never the whole. It is always a fragment, a technique without its context, a story without its original meaning, a monument whose purpose has been forgotten even as its stones endure. The knowledge shatters and the pieces scatter, and each piece finds a different resting place in a different continent, and centuries later, the cultures look at one another's fragments and sense, without quite being able to prove it, that they are all holding parts of the same broken thing. In the ancient world, traditions arose. At Eleusis, at Delphi, in the sanctuaries of Egypt, dedicated to preserving fragments of deeper knowledge through ritual and initiation. The wisdom was not written in books, but encoded in symbol and ceremony, passed through layers of meaning, designed to survive the collapse of the civilizations that carried them. A candle, shielded by many hands, carried through the longest night. There are places where the fragments are still being carried. In Australia, Aboriginal songlines encode landscape features, waterholes, rock formations, the paths of ancestral beings, in songs that have been passed down for tens of thousands of years. These are not metaphors, they are navigational instructions set to music, precise enough to guide a traveler across hundreds of miles of unfamiliar terrain. The songs describe geological features that have been confirmed by modern survey, features that would have looked different when the songs were composed because the coastlines were different and the rivers ran along paths that have since shifted. The songs remember a world that predates the one we can see. They are, in a very real sense, the oldest maps on Earth, and they are still sung, still carried across the same landscape, still encoding knowledge that predates writing by tens of thousands of years. The songs are living evidence, memory held in the same form across a span of time that would have erased any written record. A writer once described human knowledge as an island of light in an enormous ocean of darkness. If that's true, then the darkness is not empty. It is full of things we used to know and have since forgotten. Not because they weren't worth remembering, but because the carriers were lost, and the songs were interrupted, and the libraries burned, and the waters rose, and the centuries did what centuries do. The ocean of darkness is not hostile, it is simply vast. And the island of light is smaller and more recently arrived than we usually like to admit. What we call history The 5,000 years of recorded events is a single candle. What came before is everything the candlelight doesn't reach. And in that darkness, the echoes we've been listening to tonight still move, still carry the shapes of things that happened long before anyone learned to write them down. Take a breath and sit with that for a moment. An island of light in a vast and patient darkness. Not a darkness that threatens, but one that simply continues, the way the ocean continues beyond the last light of shore. Feel the weight of your body wherever you're resting. Feel the gentle pull of gravity, the same force that holds the stone circles in their places, that keeps the ocean in its basin, that draws the sediment down through the water column to its resting place on the seabed. You are held, too. You don't need to hold on to anything right now. The patterns are there, in the stone and the stories and the fragments of forgotten songs. They don't need defending. They don't need proving. They only need what they've always had. Someone willing to sit quietly and listen. And so we arrive at ourselves, the latest civilization in a pattern that may be far older and far longer than anyone suspects. Not the authors of this story, but its latest readers, holding the book open somewhere near the middle, unable to see how many chapters came before. Consider how young we are. The entirety of recorded human history, every clay tablet, every papyrus scroll, every carved inscription, every printed page covers roughly 5,000 years. Our species has existed for approximately 300,000. The readable portion of our past accounts for less than 2% of the time we've been here. The rest is silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of things that happened and were not recorded, of songs sung and never written down, of knowledge carried forward by people who held it as far as they could and then were gone. And yet, when civilizations do appear in the archaeological record, they appear suddenly. Sumer emerges with writing, mathematics, and astronomy already in place, as though the knowledge had been waiting in the wings. Egypt's earliest dynasties display a sophistication that seems to have no developmental backstory. The Indus Valley civilization appears with standardized urban planning of remarkable precision, and then vanishes almost as completely as it arrived, as though remembering, rather than inventing. Tonight we have listened to 6 echoes: the Ethereal Ones, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Builders, the Antediluvian Giants, the pre-Younger Dryas world. 6 echoes reaching across deep time, each carrying a different weight, a different kind of silence. But they are not an exhaustive list. They are the echoes we can hear from where we stand. There may be others, fainter, more distant, buried beneath layers of sediment and sea we have barely begun to survey. The pattern may extend further back than any of these stories suggest, into reaches of time so deep that no stone, no story, no chemical trace survives to mark what happened there. It doesn't matter how many came before. What matters is the pattern itself, the rising and the flourishing and the slow forgetting, repeated across spans of time so vast that the continents themselves rearranged between iterations. The ethereal ones may have been the first echo, or they may have been the last fading note of something even older. Egypt's foundations may rest on the foundations of civilizations whose names were lost before hieroglyphs were carved. The pattern has no beginning that we can see and no end that we can predict. It simply continues, rising and falling, the way a tide moves, governed by forces too deep and too slow to observe within a single human lifetime. The Golden Age myths, the Hindu yugas, the Greek ages of metal, The Mesoamerican five suns may be philosophy. They may be inherited memory. They may be the faded echo of a time when someone lived differently than we do now, and left behind just enough evidence to ensure the idea of their existence would never quite disappear, even as the proof of it did. And there is something restful in that, in not needing to know the whole story, in holding the questions gently, the way you might hold a smooth stone in your palm, feeling its weight without needing to know where it came from or how old it is. And the cycle, if it is a cycle, continues to turn, not as a threat, but as a rhythm older than any of us, older than any civilization we know by name. A rhythm written into the geology of the planet itself, into the orbital mechanics of the solar system, into the slow pulse of the Earth's magnetic field as it strengthens and weakens across millennia. There are cosmic forces that operate on timescales far beyond human planning. Asteroid orbits that cross our path at intervals measured in centuries. Volcanic systems that build pressure over tens of thousands of years. Geological processes that reshape the surface of the planet with a patience that makes human ambition look like a struck match. The Earth rotates, the stars wheel overhead, and every few tens of thousands of years, the conditions shift, sometimes gently, sometimes with a violence that redraws the map of life itself. These forces have always been here. They will continue to be here long after whatever we build has crumbled into the chemical signature of just another layer in the sediment record. But here is something new. For the first time in the pattern, if the pattern is real, the civilization living through it is aware of the cycle. We can read the ice cores, we can measure the magnetic field, we can track the orbits of objects that cross our path. We cannot control the forces that have ended previous worlds, but we can see them. And there is a strange, quiet power in that. Not mastery, but awareness. Not safety, but sight. There is no need to solve any of it tonight. The cycle does not ask to be understood. It asks only to be noticed, the way you might notice the rhythm of the tide, or the slow rotation of the stars, or the long breath of the earth as it turns through its seasons. Some patterns are older than understanding, some questions are better held than answered, and the watching itself becomes a kind of rest, not the vigilance of a god, but the quiet attention of someone who has seen the wave, acknowledged it, and chosen to sit down on the shore. Take a deep breath, let it out slowly. The cycle turns, and we are here, watching it turn, for the first time with open eyes. The pattern will still be turning when you wake. There is a question that outlasts even the cycle itself, quieter than any catastrophe, and far more enduring. If 12,000 years from now, someone comes looking for us, what will they find? Close your eyes if they aren't already. Imagine the clock jumping forward. 12,000 years. The same distance that separates us from the builders of Göbekli Tepe, from the end of the last ice age, from the rising waters that swallowed ancient coastlines and buried whatever had been built along them. Imagine the room you're in right now. The ceiling develops a leak. Water finds its way in. Over decades, the wood softens. The metal rusts. The glass holds longer, centuries, before it shatters under its own chemical fatigue. The circuit boards, the hard drives, the thin screens that hold so much of what we know, they corrode into unrecognizable chemical residue within a few lifetimes. 1,000 years from now, almost nothing electronic will remain. 5,000 years from now, the concrete will be rubble. 10,000 years from now, the rubble will be buried under soil and root systems, and the accumulated debris of a world that kept going without us. Imagine the roads. They will be among the first things to disappear. Asphalt softens, cracks, and is swallowed by root systems within a few centuries. The bridges follow, the tunnels flood and fill with silt. Somewhere in what used to be a city center, a single granite foundation stone sits in a clearing that was once a plaza, worn smooth by rain. Half covered in moss, the last recognizable fragment of a building that once held thousands of people. A fox sleeps in its shadow. Let that vision settle. Let the 12,000 years fold back into the present, gently, like waking from a dream you don't quite want to leave. The room around you is still here, the ceiling is solid, the walls are standing, you are warm. What survives? Stone. Stone survives. Göbekli Tepe has endured 12,000 years already, and it was buried by the people who built it. The Great Pyramid will likely outlast everything else we've discussed tonight. Not because it is indestructible, but because it is so vast and so dense that the forces of erosion will need tens of thousands of years to significantly diminish it. Long after every digital file has corrupted, every server farm has rusted into silence, every satellite has decayed from orbit, the pyramid will still be standing in the desert, smaller, rougher, stripped of its casing stones, but recognizably itself. Stone remembers. And in the deep future, a geologist drilling a core sample through what used to be a city might find a thin, strange layer. Unusually high concentrations of plastic molecules, odd isotope ratios, the chemical fingerprint of a mass extinction that coincided with a spike in atmospheric carbon, a faint anomaly in the record, a hiccup. And they might wonder for a moment what it meant, or perhaps they would simply note the anomaly, the way we note a vivid sunset, with quiet recognition, and then let it go. There is a strange comfort in that. Not comfort in the sense of reassurance, but comfort in the sense of perspective, the long view where everything finds its proportion. The things we worry about tonight, the urgencies that feel so large and so pressing, are part of a pattern that has repeated before and will repeat again. The cycle does not care about individual anxieties. It operates on a scale where centuries are rounding errors and entire civilizations are single data points in a very long series. The stone endures. The stories endure. The echoes travel farther than anyone expects. And somewhere, 12,000 years from now, someone may sit in the quiet and the dark and wonder about the people who came before them, the way you are wondering tonight about the people who came before us. Perhaps they will find this restful too, the long view, the deep perspective, the understanding that even the largest things eventually find their scale when measured against enough time. The questions are growing quieter now. The urgency has drained from them, the way color drains from the sky in the last minutes before dark, gently, by degrees, until what's left is soft and deep and still. Feel yourself settling deeper. Feel the weight of the blanket or the mattress or whatever is holding you. You have carried these questions far enough for one night. It's time to set them down. We've traveled a long way tonight, through deep time, through stone and water, and fire and ice, through the oldest stories that human memory preserves, and through the questions that those stories leave behind, patient, undisturbed, unhurried, like stones at the bottom of a very deep well. For a moment, just rest here. The journey has been long. The echoes have carried us across millions of years and thousands of miles, and now the distance is closing, and the stories are growing soft, and the night is waiting to receive whatever you'd like to set down. Let's visit each echo one last time, not to examine them, just to let them go. You don't need to stay awake for all of this. Wherever you stop listening, is exactly where you were meant to stop tonight. The echoes will wait. The Ethereal Ones, the first echo, the farthest and faintest. A golden age remembered in every tradition, a time when the world was different and the beings who walked it moved with a lightness we can barely imagine. Let that echo fade now. Let the golden light dim to something warm and soft, like the last glow of a sunset you watched a long time ago. Breathe in slowly and out. Let your feet relax. Let the soles of your feet soften and feel the ground or the bed holding you. Ancient Egypt, the second echo. Stone monuments older than memory, rising from the desert with a patience that makes the centuries feel small. The Sphinx, watching the eastern horizon, the Nile carrying its silt through season after season after season. The builders who looked backward to Zep-Tepi and sensed, even then, that someone had been here before them. Let the sand settle. Let the monuments stand in their own silence, the way they have stood for thousands of years. Breathe in and out. Let your legs grow heavy. Feel them sinking gently into whatever is holding them. Warm, supported, still. The Indus Valley, the third echo. Grid streets and covered drains, standardized weights and careful measurements, thousands of small clay seals inscribed with words that no one alive can read. A civilization so orderly, so quietly ambitious, that it rivaled everything in the ancient world, and then faded so completely that even its name was forgotten. Let the silence of those unread words rest. Let the river carry what it carried, and let the rest dissolve. Breathe in deeply and let it go. Let your torso soften. Let your back settle into the surface beneath you. Feel the breath moving in your chest without effort. The builders, the fourth echo, stone cut with impossible precision, pillars carved and then deliberately buried, pyramids aligned to stars that have barely shifted in 12,000 years. Let the stone rest. It has stood long enough tonight. It will still be there in the morning. Breathe in and out. Let your arms relax. Let your hands uncurl. Let your fingers go completely still. The Antediluvian Giants, the fifth echo. The strangest one, names from a dozen traditions describing beings of unusual size and power who lived in a world before the flood. Let the strangeness rest. You don't need to understand it tonight. Let the old names settle like dust on a shelf in a room you're leaving. Breathe in and out. Let your face relax, your jaw, your cheeks, the muscles around your eyes. Let the tension leave your forehead. Let it go. The pre-Younger Dryas world. The sixth echo. Stone houses and stored grain and the first tender experiments with agriculture. All of it interrupted by fire from the sky and 1,000 years of winter. But the winter ended. The ice retreated. And the survivors began again. They always begin again. Breathe in slowly and let it all the way out. Feel your whole body now, heavy, warm, held by the bed, by the dark, by the quiet. There is nothing left to carry. 6 echoes, 6 civilizations, rising and falling across a span of time so vast that the continents themselves shifted during the telling. And here we are, the latest in the pattern, lying in the dark, listening to the echoes, wondering what came before and what will come after, the way people have always wondered in every age, in every civilization, under the same patient sky. If you'd like more nights like this, 1. More slow journeys through the deep past, more questions held gently in the dark, subscribing to the Sleepy Historian is the simplest way to make sure we find each other again. There will always be another echo to follow, another forgotten civilization to visit, another night to spend drifting through deep time together. And if you're awake enough to remember, now or in the morning, I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight. Every time someone tells me they're in Lagos at 3 in the morning, or Vancouver just before midnight, or Tokyo as the first light comes up, it reminds me that all over the world, people are settling into the same old questions at the same late hour. That's a kind of quiet connection worth keeping. But that's for later. Right now, there's nothing left to do. The echoes have faded. The civilizations have returned to their layers of stone and sediment and sea. The questions are resting in the dark, the way they've rested for thousands of years, patient and unhurried, in no rush to be answered. The stone rests, the water rests, the stories rest, and you can rest too. Feel your whole body now, heavy, warm, held. You are exactly where you need to be. Just breathe.